Along the rugged boundary between Utah and Arizona, where the Colorado River winds through towering sandstone cliffs, sculpted over millions of years, lies one of America's most remarkable man-made lakes, Lake Powell. By total storage capacity, it ranks as the nation's second-largest reservoir and has played a central role in supplying water and electricity throughout the Southwest for decades. Lake Powell came into existence after the completion of Glen Canyon Dam in 1963. Rising roughly 710 feet above the Colorado River, the massive concrete structure transformed a deep canyon into an enormous reservoir stretching nearly 200 miles into southern Utah. When filled to capacity, it can store about 26 million acre-feet of water, supporting cities, agriculture, and hydroelectric generation for more than 40 million people across several western states. For many years, the reservoir symbolized engineering success. But over the past 2 decades, official measurements have painted a very different picture. Since the early 2000s, Lake Powell has experienced one of the most significant and prolonged declines ever recorded for a reservoir of its size in the United States. Near the end of the 1990s, the lake surface remained close to its intended operating level, sitting at roughly 3,700 feet above sea level. By the spring of 2023, however, the water had fallen to around 3,520 feet, bringing it alarmingly close to the level engineers identify as dead pool, the point where the dam can no longer function as originally designed. Most discussions stop by describing this as another chapter in the American Southwest's long-running drought. But scientists, hydrologists, and water managers increasingly argue that the situation involves far more than temporary dry weather. The changes being observed suggest deeper, long-term shifts affecting the entire Colorado River system. If the reservoir falls below approximately 3,490 feet, Glen Canyon Dam loses the ability to release water through its primary outlet structures, and its hydroelectric generators can no longer produce electricity. Those engineering thresholds have transformed what was once considered a distant possibility into a very real concern. As the shoreline continues to retreat, another extraordinary process is unfolding. Landscapes that disappeared beneath the reservoir more than 60 years ago are slowly returning to daylight. Ancient side canyons, winding river channels, sandstone formations, and archaeological sites that vanished beneath rising water during the 1960s are beginning to emerge once again. Among these discoveries are traces of ancestral Puebloan communities, remarkable cliff dwellings, and natural rock formations that many believed would remain underwater indefinitely. Their reappearance offers researchers an opportunity that previous generations never expected to witness. The return of these hidden landscapes has reopened an important conversation about what was lost when Glen Canyon was flooded. Long before the reservoir existed, this region was recognized as one of the American West's richest environments for both archaeology and ecology. Today, as Lake Powell continues to shrink, the canyon beneath it is revealing pieces of history that had remained hidden for more than half a century. What is happening here is no longer simply the story of a declining reservoir. It has become a window into the future of water management across the Colorado River Basin, and a reminder that decisions made decades ago continue to shape the challenges facing the American Southwest today. And the people who fought to prevent its flooding knew exactly what the world was about to lose. Glen Canyon was not famous before they killed it. That was part of the problem. The canyon system stretched for nearly 200 miles along the Colorado River from the confluence with the Dirty Devil River in southern Utah down to Lee's Ferry at the border of Arizona. The main canyon and its tributaries, the Escalante River, the San Juan River, and dozens of smaller side canyons cutting into the Navajo sandstone, formed a labyrinth of red rock that very few people had ever seen. The terrain was difficult to access. No roads reached the river. Music. No trails descended the canyon walls. The only way to experience Glen Canyon was by boat floating the Colorado through a landscape that combined the scale of the Grand Canyon with an intimacy that the Grand Canyon's sheer walls did not permit. The side canyons were the revelation. Unlike the Grand Canyon, where the river runs at the bottom of a mile-deep chasm, music, with minimal access to the surrounding landscape, Glen Canyon's tributaries were navigable. A boater could pull ashore, walk up a side canyon, and find themselves in chambers carved by millions of years of water and wind. Natural cathedrals with curved sandstone walls rising hundreds of feet overhead, light filtering down through narrow slots, silence music that had accumulated over geological time. One of these chambers became legendary, the Cathedral in the desert. Located in Clear Creek Canyon, a tributary of the Escalante River, the cathedral was a natural amphitheater of Navajo sandstone. Music, a curved alcove with a small waterfall at the back, a pool at the base, and acoustics that early visitors described as otherworldly. The walls rose in sweeping arcs of red and orange stone. The light that penetrated the music's narrow entrance illuminated the interior with a diffuse glow that changed by the hour and the season. Almost no one had seen it before the 1950s. Music. By the 1960s, it would be underwater. The decision to build Glen Canyon Dam was made in the context of the broader Colorado River Storage Project, a federal program authorized by Congress in 1956, music, to construct a series of dams across the upper Colorado River Basin. The purpose was water storage and hydroelectric power generation for the rapidly growing American Southwest. The original proposal included a dam at Echo Park within Dinosaur National Monument. Conservationists, led by David Brower of the Sierra Club, fought the Echo Park Dam with everything they had. They produced films, organized letter-writing campaigns, and testified music before Congress. The campaign succeeded. Echo Park was removed from the project. The price of that victory was Glen Canyon. The dam builders needed a site. Glen Canyon was offered as an alternative, a place that was not music protected by national monument status, that had no organized constituency, that almost no one in America had ever heard of. Brower later called the decision America's most regretted environmental decision. He had never seen Glen Canyon when he agreed to the compromise. Almost no one had. In the years between the dam's authorization in 1956 and the closure of the diversion tunnels in 1963, a small number of people made it their mission to document what was about to disappear. Elliot Porter, an American photographer known for his pioneering color nature photography, floated Glen Canyon multiple times in the early 1960s. Porter's photographs, music, captured the side canyons, the light, the intimate scale of a landscape that existed nowhere else on Earth. The Sierra Club published Porter's work in 1963 as The Place No One Knew, Glen Canyon on the Colorado. The title was bitter and deliberate. The book appeared just as the dam gates closed and the reservoir began to fill. The photographs showed a world that was, at the moment, music of publication, already disappearing underwater. Readers could see the cathedral in the desert, the hanging gardens of ferns and columbines fed by seeping springs, the ancestral music pueblo and granaries tucked into alcoves above the river. And they could know, looking at each image, that they would never see these places, music, in person. The water rose. By 1980, Lake Powell was full. Glen Canyon was gone. The canyon was not empty of human history when the water covered it. Ancestral Puebloan peoples, the ancestors of modern Hopi, Zuni, music, and other Pueblo communities, had inhabited the Glen Canyon region for centuries. They built cliff dwellings in the alcoves above the river. They constructed granaries to store corn in protected niches. They left rock art panels on the canyon walls, petroglyphs and pictographs, recording their presence across hundreds of years. The Glen Canyon region contained hundreds of these sites. When the dam was authorized, federal law required archaeological salvage, an attempt to document and excavate music significant sites before they were destroyed. The Glen Canyon Project, led by Jesse Jennings of the University of Utah and Robert Lister of the University of Colorado, conducted emergency archaeology throughout the late 1950s, music, and the early 1960s. They did what they could. It was not enough. The canyon system was too large, the timeline too compressed, the funding too limited. Many sites were inadequately documented. Some were never found at all. The archaeologists knew they were losing material that would never be recovered. Burial sites, music ceremonial spaces, the accumulated evidence of human habitation spanning a millennium. The water covered it all. The cultural significance extended beyond archaeology. The Navajo Nation, whose reservation borders Lake Powell to the south and east, holds Glen Canyon as sacred land. The Hopi, Zuni, Ute, and Paiute nations all have historical and spiritual connections to the region. The sites that were flooded were not just archaeological resources. Music. They were places of ongoing cultural significance to living communities. The dam was built anyway. The consultation with tribal nations that would be required today was perfunctory or non-existent in the 1950s. The flooding proceeded on a federal timeline that prioritized water delivery and power generation over every other consideration. For 60 years, the drowned canyon existed only in photographs and memory. Then, the water began to drop. The decline of Lake Powell is not a music drought. A drought is temporary. The rain returns. The reservoirs refill. The system reverts to its previous music state. What is happening to Lake Powell is structural. The Colorado River is shrinking. The river's average annual flow, as measured over the past century, music is substantially lower than the flow estimates used to allocate its water in 1922. The Colorado River Compact, the foundational legal document that divided the river among 7 music states, was based on data from an unusually wet period in the early 20th century. The compact promised more water than the river typically delivers. For decades, the discrepancy was masked by storage. Lake Powell and Lake Mead together held over 50 million acre-feet of water at full capacity. Music. When inflows fell short of allocations, the reservoirs made up the difference. The reservoirs' music are no longer making up the difference. They are draining. A 2022 paper by Park Williams and colleagues, published in Nature, Music Climate Change, used tree ring reconstructions to place the current drought in historical context. Music. The conclusion was stark. The drought that began around 2000 is the most severe in at least 1,200 years. Music. And it is not just a drought. Approximately 42% of the drought severity, Williams found, music can be attributed to human-caused climate change. Higher temperatures mean more evaporation from reservoirs and earlier melting of the mountain snowpack that feeds the Colorado River system. The river is shrinking because the climate is warming. This is not a cycle. It is a trajectory. Lake Powell's decline reflects that trajectory. In 2000, the reservoir was nearly full. By 2005, it had dropped significantly, but remained well above crisis levels. By 2010, the decline had accelerated. By 2015, the upper reaches of the lake had begun to expose the original canyon floor. Height Marina, the most upstream access point on Lake Powell, was closed permanently as the water receded too far for boats to navigate. By 2020, the Dirty Devil and Escalante River arms of the lake had largely drained, exposing miles of canyon that had been underwater for half a century. By April 2023, the main body of Lake Powell sat at approximately 3,520 music feet, 30 feet above dead pool. Dead pool is not a metaphor. Music, it is an engineering threshold. At 3,490 music feet of elevation, the river outlet works. The lower set of release valves in Glen Canyon Dam, music, can no longer function. There is not enough hydraulic head to push water through the outlets. The dam becomes, in effect, a plug. Water continues to flow into the reservoir from the Colorado River and its tributaries, but no water can flow out through the dam. At the same elevation, the hydroelectric turbines, music, stop generating power. The dam's ability to deliver electricity to the grid, currently over 1,300 megawatts of generating capacity, drops to zero. Below Dead Pool, Glen Canyon Dam ceases to function as a water delivery and power generation system. It becomes a wall. The implications for the 40 million people downstream in Arizona, Nevada, California, and Mexico are severe. Lake Mead, downstream of Glen Canyon Dam, receives most of its inflow from Glen Canyon releases. If Glen Canyon cannot release water, Lake Mead's decline accelerates. The two reservoirs are operationally linked. The crisis at one becomes a crisis at both. The Bureau of Reclamation has been managing this crisis with increasing desperation. Emergency releases have been curtailed to preserve storage. The 2007 interim guidelines established frameworks for shortage sharing among the lower basin states. The 2019 Drought Contingency Plan added additional voluntary cuts. The 2023 Lower Basin Agreement committed Arizona, California, and Nevada music to substantial reductions through 2026. None of these measures have stopped the decline. They have slowed it. The reservoirs continue to drop, and as Lake Powell drops, something unexpected is happening. The canyon is music coming back. The cathedral in the desert, submerged since the 1960s, music has periodically re-emerged during low water periods. In 2022 and 2023, music as Lake Powell approached historic lows, the cathedral emerged more fully than it had in decades. The waterfall that Elliot Porter photographed in 1962, music, was flowing again. The curved sandstone walls, stained by 60 years of submersion, but structurally intact, rose once more into open air. Visitors who had seen Porter's photographs, music, who had read The Place No One Knew, and mourned a landscape they assumed was gone forever, were able to float into the cathedral and see music it with their own eyes. The experience was described as resurrection. Music. The cathedral was not the only feature to return. Throughout the Escalante River arm, side canyons that had been underwater for half a century re-emerged music into the desert air. Hanging gardens that had somehow survived submersion began to bloom again. Archaeological sites that had been flooded before they could be fully documented became accessible for the first time since the dam was built. Cataract Canyon, music. The stretch of whitewater upstream of the reservoir's original extent, music began to extend downstream as the slack water retreated. The Colorado River was reclaiming its original character. Music. The rapids, the sandbars, the riparian ecology that had existed before the dam. The reemergence raised questions that the Bureau of Reclamation had never planned to answer. What do you do, music, when a drowned canyon comes back? The Glen Canyon Institute has an answer. Founded in 1996, Music, the Institute has advocated for decades for what it calls the Phil Mead First Proposal, a policy that would consolidate Colorado River storage in Lake Mead and allow Lake Powell to drain entirely. The logic is straightforward. The two reservoirs lose enormous amounts of water to evaporation. Music, approximately 1 million acre-feet per year combined. Lake Powell, with its long, shallow arms extending into porous sandstone, loses water both to evaporation and to seepage into the rock. A single reservoir loses less water than two reservoirs with the same total storage capacity. If water policy prioritized efficiency over the status quo, Lake Powell would be allowed to drain. Lake Mead would hold the consolidated storage. Glen Canyon would return. The proposal has been dismissed as politically impossible for most of its music existence. But politics change when reservoirs approach Dead Pool. The 2022 to 2023 atmospheric rivers that temporarily refilled Lake Powell demonstrated the volatility of the system. Wet winters can reverse years of decline in a single music season, but they also demonstrated the structural deficit. The wet winter bought time. It did not solve the problem. The Bureau of Reclamation's 24-month studies continue to project scenarios in which Lake Powell approaches music or reaches dead pool. The studies are probabilistic. They do not predict the future with certainty, but they consistently model outcomes in which the dam stops functioning as designed. If that happens, when that happens, the Philmead first proposal will no longer be theoretical. It will be the situation on the ground. The dam will be a wall that cannot release water. The canyon behind it will be exposed. The question will not be whether to restore Glen Canyon, but how to manage a restoration that is already underway. The sediment complicates everything. Glen Canyon Dam has been trapping Colorado River sediment since 1963. The river carries millions of tons of sand, silt, and clay each year. Material that once flowed through the Grand Canyon and ultimately reached the Gulf of California. Now it accumulates behind the dam. Estimates suggest that Lake Powell loses approximately 100,000 acre-feet of storage capacity per year to sedimentation. The sediment buries the original canyon floor under layers of accumulated debris. If Lake Powell drains, the sediment will be exposed. The canyon that returns will not be identical to the canyon that was flooded. The sediment deposits will reshape the landscape. The side canyons may be partially filled. The original riverbed may be buried under decades of accumulated material. The ecological implications are significant. Music. The Grand Canyon, downstream of Glen Canyon Dam, has been starved of sediment for 60 years. The beaches that once characterized the canyon's riparian zones have eroded. The native fish species that evolved with the river's natural sediment load have declined. If Lake Powell drains, the sediment may begin to move again. The dam has bypass tunnels, the original diversion tunnels used during construction that could theoretically allow sediment-laden water to pass downstream. Managing that sediment pulse would be an engineering and ecological challenge without precedent. But it would also be an opportunity. The Grand Canyon ecosystem could begin to heal, the beaches could rebuild. Music. The native fish could recover habitat they have not had access to in 60 years. The canyon that returns would be different. Music from the canyon that was lost. But it would be a canyon, not a reservoir. The tribal nations whose ancestors inhabited Glen Canyon are watching the reemergence with complex music emotions. The sites that are returning from beneath the water are sacred places, the cliff dwellings, music, the granaries, the rock art panels. These are not archaeological curiosities. They are the heritage of living peoples. The flooding of Glen Canyon was done without meaningful consultation. The Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe, music, and other tribal nations were not partners in the decision. They were informed of it. The 2023 Supreme Court decision in Navajo Nation versus Arizona underscored the ongoing uncertainty of tribal water rights in the Colorado River system. The court ruled against the Navajo Nation's claim to enforceable water rights, music leaving millions of people on the reservation without secure access to the river that flows through their ancestral lands. The politics of water in the American Southwest, music, have always been politics of power. The people who built Glen Canyon Dam did so, music, because they could. The people who lost Glen Canyon lost it because they lacked the power to prevent its loss. The reemergence of the canyon does not undo that history, but it does raise the question of what happens next. If Lake Powell drains to dead pool, the Bureau of Reclamation will face a choice. Option 1 is to attempt to refill the reservoir and restore the system to its designed operation. This option requires sustained increases in Colorado River flow that climate projections suggest are unlikely. It requires continued water deliveries that the river may not be able to provide. It requires betting that music, the past, the water-rich past that the 1922 compact assumed was normal, will return. Option 2 is to accept music that the reservoir cannot be sustained and begin planning for a Colorado River system, music after Lake Powell. This option requires renegotiating the legal frameworks that govern Colorado River water allocation. It requires rebuilding water infrastructure for a smaller river. It requires acknowledging that the engineering achievements of the 20th century were built on assumptions that the 21st century has invalidated. Neither option is politically easy, music. But the river does not care about politics. The river is shrinking. The reservoir is draining. The canyon is coming back. David Brower, music, spent the last decades of his life trying to undo the decision he had made in the 1950s. Music, he founded Friends of the Earth in 1969 in part to continue the environmental advocacy, music, that the Sierra Club had pioneered. He helped found the Glen Canyon Institute in 1996. Music explicitly dedicated to restoring the canyon he had traded away. David Brower often described Glen Canyon as the landscape the world never truly had the chance to know. To him, that wasn't just a poetic phrase. It was a criticism of history itself. He believed that if ordinary Americans had witnessed the canyon's beauty before the dam was approved, public opinion might have shifted. More photographs, greater awareness, and stronger public pressure could have changed the outcome, just as conservation campaigns had protected other treasured places across the American West. Instead, recognition arrived only after the flooding had already begun. By the time people fully understood what had been sacrificed, the rising waters had buried much of the canyon beneath Lake Powell. The breathtaking photographs captured by Elliot Porter became more than works of art. They became historical records of a landscape that seemed destined to survive only in memory. Decades later, those same images are serving an entirely different purpose. As water levels continue to retreat, travelers are using Porter's photographs almost like maps, comparing scenes captured in the 1960s with the remarkable landscapes now reappearing before their eyes. Rock chambers, narrow sandstone corridors, waterfalls, and dramatic cathedral-like formations, once believed lost forever, are becoming visible once again. This doesn't mean Glen Canyon has returned exactly as it once was. 60 years beneath the reservoir have changed the terrain. Sediment has reshaped sections of the canyon, and many archaeological sites have suffered damage after decades underwater. Even so, the landscape itself has not disappeared. Against all expectations, it is gradually revealing itself once again. For years, conservationists asked whether humanity could ever reverse the decision that transformed Glen Canyon into a reservoir. Ironically, that question is now being answered not through legislation or political agreements, but through the natural limits of the Colorado River. As inflows continue to decline, Lake Powell is shrinking on its own. No official decision has been made to remove Glen Canyon Dam. Instead, the reservoir behind it is steadily losing water. If levels continue to fall toward dead pool, the dam's ability to generate electricity and release water through its normal systems will eventually be compromised. The canyon's return is not the result of a restoration project. It is the consequence of changing environmental conditions. Should that moment arrive, the United States will face challenges far beyond the canyon itself. Millions of people throughout the Southwest rely on the Colorado River for drinking water, agriculture, and electricity. Aging infrastructure may require extensive redesign, long-standing water agreements could face difficult negotiations, and political debates over limited water resources are likely to become even more intense. Yet beneath those policy discussions, another story continues to unfold. Glen Canyon, once hidden beneath one of America's largest reservoirs, is slowly reclaiming its place on the landscape. Ancient sandstone walls, hanging gardens, winding side canyons, and traces of ancestral pueblo and communities are emerging from beneath waters that covered them for more than 6 decades. David Brower never witnessed this remarkable transformation. Elliot Porter never had the opportunity either. But their work remains, allowing a new generation to compare the past with the present as the canyon steadily reappears. Today, Glen Canyon Dam still stands, while Lake Powell continues to recede. Water managers across the American Southwest are searching for solutions to an increasingly uncertain future. But the river itself is already revealing part of the answer. Every foot of falling water exposes another chapter of a landscape many believed had vanished forever. Lake Powell's decline is no longer just a story about a reservoir. It has become a defining question about the future of water in the American West. Whatever decisions governments make in the years ahead will influence millions of lives, but regardless of those choices, Glen Canyon is returning. Patiently, steadily, and one shoreline at a time.